change, their origins, impact, and solutions. Dr. Petering, welcome to Christ Church, and thank you for sharing some of your expertise with us.
Very happy to. Yeah. Good. Pleasure to be here with you. I'm a Lutheran from Bayshore Lutheran Church just down the road. But actually, I spent a good deal of my childhood in an Episcopalian church. I was in an Episcopalian boys choir. And so I have an affinity for Episcopalian service, let's say. So I'm pleased to be with you here. And we want to talk about climate change, which is the defining problem, really, of our age and for all time going forward, unless we get a handle on this very quickly. So we're going to start right out showing you what the problem is. So you're going to see a number of graphs during the course of this talk. Hopefully they're a help, not a hindrance. But if we take a look over time at what's happened to the average temperature of the surface of the Earth, you'll see that starting out in, let's say, 1850 and so forth, we're down here, which is just arbitrarily defined as 0. There's a little change in the early 20th century, but you notice what's happened since 1960. There's just been this inexorable increase in the average surface temperature. And if you take a look, and you probably see this in the newspaper and so forth, every year that comes along is hotter than the year before. That's what this graph is showing, and that's what you see here. It used to be that 2014 was part of this list, but I had to cross it out now that we have the information for 2024. So the consequences of climate change are enormous, and they're very different in type and so forth. I'm just going to show you a few examples. Later on, we're going to talk more in depth about this. So, of course, you're well aware of the tragic forest fires that took place around Los Angeles because that forest was so dry, nothing was going to stop its progression in terms of a fire. We saw this year also Hurricane Helene, which did something we've never seen before with hurricanes. It just drove up, not along the coast, but through the interior of North Carolina and Tennessee, and just did devastating damage. But those sorts of things were occurring all over the earth. So the Amazon basin, a large part of that is now drought-stricken. So this is one of the tributaries in the Amazon. These are all houseboats and so forth that are now landlocked because there's no water there. Okay, and we go to Spain, you had the opposite effect. They had enormous flooding this past year as well. So this type of extreme weather event as a result of global warming is occurring more and more frequently, and the scale is just getting larger and larger as we go along. So we're going to look at several topics here. We're going to start out just talking about what Earth is like, okay, as a livable planet. Then we'll look at climate change. What's the underlying causation of climate change? You're surely aware that greenhouse gases are the proximate cause of climate change. And we'll look at what are the consequences then of these increases in the amount of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Then we've got to get into talking about what are we going to do if we decide to do something in a concerted way about climate change. And that is to really how to decarbonize the energy network. And finally, we're going to bring this back to Milwaukee and talk about Milwaukee's climate and equity plan and what's contained in that and how we could participate in it. So we're all Christians here in this room, and I thought we should start out right at the beginning. at the beginning of Genesis, where as God was creating this planet, at every step of the process, the evaluation was, and it was good. There are a lot of ways you could think about what good means, but good surely means it was good as a planet to live on. Okay, and that's the way I would think about this. Well, we said the Apostles' Creed this morning, and honestly, every time we say it, I'm just astounded by how little we have to say about God the Creator. So I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and that's it. That was the 4th century BC. The question is there anything else we might say in the 21st century about this, either as Christians or in a larger way as people who know more about the planet, if you will. So this is where we're going to start out with. And when we think about Earth as a livable planet, the first thing we think about often, if you read articles about this, is that we are in the so-called habitable zone. And you see that, shown here, where we're simply looking at, these are sizes of stars. Here's our star, the sun. And over here are the distances away from the sun, and here's how the habitable zone is displayed. If you've got a small star that's a little cooler, the habitable zone's closer. Here we are for Earth, and then we would go further out for larger stars and so forth. So that's good. What do we mean by habitable zone? It means we can have liquid water, along with, in our case, both solid or ice and so forth, and the gaseous form of water. We can move between those states very easily with little changes of energy, heat energy, and that makes for a world in which we can live with liquid water as kind of the basis for all life, if you will. So there's a lot more, though, to the idea of habitable zone than just to say that we're at a certain distance so we get a certain energy impinging upon the surface of the Earth. For one thing, we have to have a circular planet. Turns out most planets, all these planets that are being discovered around other stars, most of them have elliptical orbits. So sometimes they might be in a habitable zone, but other times they would be out of it, either too hot or too cold. That doesn't work. So a few of them, relatively speaking, have circular orbits. But the nice thing about Earth is Earth rotates once every 24 hours. So the whole planet is getting bathed in sun on a regular basis, if you will. It's also got a nice axis of rotation so that over the course of the year, let's say during the summer, the northern hemisphere, during the winter, the southern hemisphere, all of the planet gets bathed in that sunlight that gives the heat necessary to support life on Earth, if you will. We also have a moon. The moon helps keep this rotational axis stable, okay? But there's something else. The moon, of course, is getting bathed with the sun just like we are. But if you take a look at the temperatures on the moon, during the day, they're hundreds of degrees above zero. At night, they're hundreds of degrees below zero. So what's the difference? The difference is we've got an atmosphere. And that atmosphere helps keep the heat around the surface of the Earth, if you will. So I've just shown this. I hope it's not too obtuse here, but here's the sun, and here's the sunlight coming in, and I'm just showing it with all of the component colors of white light coming in. And of course, a lot of this gets simply reflected up in the atmosphere, let's say reflected off in clouds. But other sunlight reaches the Earth, and that's absorbed. Some of it then is released, and when it's released as heat. That heat could be then dissipated back into space, if you will. But the atmosphere contains molecules that also will intercept that heat or it's really heat energy, if you will. One of those molecules is carbon dioxide. So as the heat is being reflected back out, carbon dioxide picks it up, absorbs it, releases it, absorbs it, releases it, and in the process keeps a certain amount of heat in that atmosphere. And in fact, if we didn't have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, this planet would be frozen. Okay, we would not be in the habitable zone. So the habitable zone is really very contingent upon what's in the atmosphere. Venus is the other way. 96% of its atmosphere is carbon dioxide. It has a runaway so-called greenhouse effect where it's just keeping all of that heat in. It has an enormously high average temperature in the atmosphere. Okay, so the other thing we want to think about the atmosphere is that it's kind of the mediator that takes this heat and distributes it between the surface of the land and the ocean. Now, the ocean turns out to be enormously important on this planet for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that it's basically the sink into which most of the heat that is coming down and reaching the planetary surface remains. Okay, so that being the case, with this increase in global surface temperature, it wouldn't be surprising that the top layer of the ocean, which is the part that is monitored, that's also increasing in temperature, and you can see that over here, where in effect we're also again looking at temperature. This is done in a little different way, and don't worry about what this is, but you can see that since this period of time now, we've had this increase in temperature in the ocean. So now the average surface temperature is 1 degree higher than it was in 1990, if you will. Okay, so I want to say just something about water here, because water has this remarkable property that is so important, and of course we take all of this for granted, and we can take it for granted because this is our livable planet. It has what we call a very high heat capacity. Now, heat capacity means that it can absorb a lot of heat in a certain unit volume per small change in temperature. Okay? There are a lot of materials that will absorb heat but change temperature by a huge amount. Okay? Water can do this without changing temperature very much at all. So we're very fortunate on this planet that we've got this huge volume of the oceans and so forth that can absorb a lot of heat without changing the temperature very much of either the ocean or the atmosphere above it, if you will. So that's an important feature that relates to habitability as well. Okay, now what I've just told you is true for any planet that is circling any star. What is special about the Earth, and this is where sort of the rare Earth idea is propagated on now to living systems, is the fact that when the solar energy impinges upon the Earth, living systems can take that energy and convert it into usable work. Okay, that's a very different concept than just passively absorbing and releasing heat, if you will. So this is what I'm talking about here. Over the course of evolutionary times, which of course is billions of years now, we have, or living systems, or more specifically plants, have learned how to take that solar energy and basically convert it into living material. Okay? Anything that happens here, anything that takes place, when I move my arms, when you take a drink of coffee, any of this has an energy component to it. So when you think about evolution taking place, this is all depending upon having usable energy that can be directed into the process of sort of developing the biosphere as we know it today. So I've just shown over here on the left a picture of a particularly attractive part of a tropical ecosystem, if you will. And just to summarize, and you probably have a feel for this, biosphere is composed of discrete ecosystems. Those ecosystems themselves, if you delve down into them, are enormously complex in terms of the numbers of organisms, types of organisms, so on, and then how they interact with one another. And we sort of summarize this by saying everything's connected to everything else. And then there's another feature that we'll be looking at shortly, and that is that there are a lot of cycles in those interconnections here. And I show this, and we'll use this symbol during the course of the presentation and so forth, to illustrate and symbolize this. Here's everything connecting to everything else, and here's one of our little cycles, if you will. Okay, now, when I was at UWM and teaching and so forth, I taught biochemistry, and so I have to also talk a little bit about biochemistry. I try to get out of that bind, but I just have to do it. So you have to put up with me, I guess. So we're going to talk about sort of what's at the heart of living systems and their use of energy. And that's the so-called carbon and energy cycle. And really, it's something that I think everybody can understand. We have two processes that you've heard of. One of these is photosynthesis, the other one's respiration. In photosynthesis, water and carbon dioxide are combined with one another to make oxygen and an organic molecule called glucose. Okay, now that's what green plants do. And what they're doing in the process is they're basically taking these two molecules, using solar energy as the process kind of to drive product formation, and we're storing that solar energy in these molecules. So we're converting sunlight into actually chemical energy. And then all of us, plants and all the rest of us, we're doing this right now, are carrying out respiration, where we take glucose or a lot of other molecules that are derived from glucose, react them with oxygen. We're breathing in that oxygen right now, going right back to the same starting materials, water and carbon dioxide, and generating biological forms of energy that are used to basically make living systems and keep them alive. Well, it's an incredible, simple cycle, okay? It's the sort of recycling system that we wish we knew how to do as human beings in our built environment, okay? But the end result of this is take solar energy and convert it to biological energy. Well, this is the key to understanding the biosphere. It's also the key to understanding climate change, okay? So that biological energy is used to drive, that is, provide the energy for all organisms to carry out the biosynthesis that they always have to be doing to either make an organism or to keep that organism alive. Okay, and that then refers to cells, organisms, ecosystems, or the biosphere. You can think about it at every one of those levels, if you will. Now, a little side fact that is always when I teach this, I say, man, this is so neat, and that is the starting material for everything else that takes place in terms of all of these biosynthetic processes, making all the molecules, DNA, RNA, protein, you name it, is glucose. Okay, so this is really the heart of life on this planet. Okay, now there's some other features that we have to understand about this process, and I'm not going to tell you all of them, but obviously we've just talked about carbon dioxide before, and so this cycle is intimately involved in providing the heat retention device in the atmosphere that lets this be a living planet, a habitable planet. Okay? Neat. Okay, so geology is connected to biology, if you will. Now, the other thing that, of course, I think you begin to recognize where we're headed is that actually this cycle isn't perfect. Over the course of geological time, as organisms died and underwent biodegradation and so forth back to carbon dioxide and water, some of it just dropped out of that process and ended up being buried, and over eons of time were converted into what we would call fossil carbon in the form of oil, coal, and gas, or natural gas. Okay? And that was just fine, not a problem. Okay, so that's the way the world was, if you will. Now we want to take a look at what's happened since humanity sort of entered into this ongoing history of the planet. Okay, I should say, before we get there, I just wanted to quote, for me, probably the most influential biochemist, molecular biologist of the 20th century, Jacques Monod, who wrote a book called Chance and Necessity, very interesting book. And he wrote in that, just as a scientist, the miracle stands explained. That's what scientists do. It does not seem any less miraculous. That's the miracle of the 20th century with the coming of science, if you will. Einstein said something of the same sort about looking at the planet from a scientific point of view. Okay, now as we move into this sort of the momentous part of this journey when humans entered the planet, I want to go back again to Genesis. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. Okay, now, we're going to have occasion to come back and talk about really what was meant by the term dominion. But Old Testament scholars will tell you that basically the idea of dominion goes back to basically all the way back to God saying, and it was good. Okay, and that our responsibility is we need to care for the earth. Okay, made in his image, we need to care for the earth. And that's really quite explicit in the second story of creation in the second chapter of Genesis. And the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it, that is to use it, we all have to use it, and keep it. Okay, and I like this terminology, we have this in the Lutheran Church, God's work, our hands. Okay, you put those two together, I think, in the way you think about this. And if we're able to do this, this is what we have. All right, now, you think about pre-industrial revolution time, basically, here's the biosphere. It's essentially intact. And here's the imprint of man, of humans, upon the earth. We had a small population. We weren't really very capable of doing much to the planet. And so the planet was largely intact. I won't say exactly what was going on in our part of the world, but it really wasn't significant for the whole biosphere, if you will. The way Herman Daly talks about this, he's really a great person to read, and here's a good book to start out with, if you will. He's a pioneering environmental economist. He calls this the empty world, where there's just a very small consumption of renewable energy, and that's why we have such a little impact, if you will. So we're basically burning wood, things like this. Okay? We're not doing very much in the natural world. What happens after 1750 when inventors and engineers and so forth really began to understand how to get a hold of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, and put them to use in machines. Okay, over the course of that period of time up until the present, you've basically switched now to a use of fossil energy, and instead of having this very small population and built environment, now we have an enormous population and a huge built environment that's of the same size as the biosphere. And what's happened in the process is there's been a substantial degradation of all of the processes that actually are necessary for planetary livability on the biosphere side. And on the built environment side, we're stuck with, living with a lot of different processes taking place that are not connected with one another. And there's a lot to be said about that, but we want to just focus on the climate change aspect of this. And again, using the Herman Daly terminology here, we're talking about an empty world, small consumption of renewable solar energy. Over here, full world, huge consumption, non-renewable energy producing carbon dioxide. Okay, so that's the situation. All right, so now let's talk a little bit deeper about causation. So if we go back to what we were looking at before in terms of this quotation from Genesis, now the term dominion really has changed. Now it's domination. A lot of scholars have really nailed Christianity because of this terminology of let them have dominion over, not recognizing that actually the original understanding of this was quite different than our sort of contemporary understanding of dominion as domination. So God's work on our hands, what have we been doing with our hands? Well, in what we're talking about today, we've been doing the things that are leading to this enormous stress upon the planet because of global warming. And there's a little quote in Genesis chapter 3 that I always come back to when Adam and Eve are consigned to live outside the Garden of Eden. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you. So if you don't keep it, you lose it. That's the ancient story, and that's what's playing out at the present time. Okay, so this is where we were at the beginning. What's happened by 2025? This is what's happened. And then in terms of this picture, it's a very straightforward picture. We're mobilizing all of these stores very rapidly of fossil energy. As we burn them, we're generating carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is adding to the total amount of greenhouse gases, which are conserving the heat that's coming in or is being generated on the surface of the planet. So there's excess heat retention, and that's leading to global warming. Okay? Now, here's what actually took place after 1800 and so forth. Initially, as I said, we were burning wood, and then as you get to 1850 and people are learning how to use these fossil fuels with machines and so forth, here we start to use coal, and then oil, and then natural gas, a little bit of nuclear down here. And the important point about this is just to look at adding all of these up. We're looking at energy here, so in about 1870, on just a relative basis, we have a total of 3 units. 1925 even, that's 100 years ago, that's 18. Year 2000, we're up to 100. Okay, so we're just using more and more of these fossil fuels and generating more carbon dioxide at the same time. Okay, now why were we doing that? Well, basically to produce, to use the economist term, goods and services. Okay, so in this graph, we're looking at the gross domestic product over time. And you can see back in the 1800s, this was very small, relatively speaking. And now we're just exponentially increasing the GDP. Okay? So when you do this, if I overlay the previous information about energy use, you can see energy use is going up as well. GDP really and energy use have to go together because goods and services represent work. And work needs that input. Where are we getting it? We're getting it from fossil fuels, if you will. So this is the problem. And just as the GDP is going up like this, so is the use of fossil fuels and the amount of energy being used. Okay, so just to be clear about this, this is just a chemical equation that will show us what we're talking about. Here's natural gas, or methane. Okay, we burn methane when we're burning natural gas. Okay, we burn it with oxygen, and we make heat energy. That's why we do it. Okay, we use that heat energy to make our machines go, to make our power plants produce electricity, to make our cars operate, everything. But what comes along with it necessarily is for every unit of heat energy, there's a unit of carbon dioxide that's being produced as well. All right, so that's the problem. Well, along in the 1960s, people began to really be concerned about this and start to measure what's happening in the atmosphere. So somebody had the idea of going to Hawaii. That was a good idea, to measure carbon dioxide. And this is what is seen over time. Whoops, sorry. It's just inexorably increasing as we're generating more energy. So you put those data onto this original curve that we had of temperature increase, and this is CO2, and they just go right along with one another. So this is a very solid story, scientifically, in terms of evidence, in terms of what's going on, if you will. Okay, now I want to say a few things about carbon dioxide. First of all, carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas, and that's a very important thing to know. The other two major ones are methane, or natural gas, and nitrous oxide. So methane is produced naturally, so there's always a background of methane in the atmosphere because of microorganisms doing their own metabolism. But besides that, because of natural gas production and so forth, there's a lot of leakage in that that's generating extra methane in the atmosphere and so forth. So methane is a significant part of this sort of portfolio of greenhouse gases that are causing climate change. The other one is nitrous oxide. Now again, nitrous oxide is produced by microorganisms that are living in soils that now sees this bonanza of fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers that are being put on fields all over the world, if you will. Well, they don't care about what they might be doing in terms of making corn. They just say this is good for my own metabolism, and part of that metabolism leads to nitrous oxide. Okay, now the fact of the matter is that carbon dioxide concentration is higher than it's been in 2 million years, and methane and nitrous oxide concentrations are higher than they've been in at least 800,000 years. Those are conclusions that come from a group, huge group really, sponsored by the United Nations called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Okay, and they put out reports regularly, And there are, if you're interested, there are nice summary reports. They're huge reports, but they also have a nice executive summary at the front end that's good for people like me, and it could be for you as well. Okay, but clearly the big one here is carbon dioxide. Okay, now I just want to talk about one property. These are some properties of carbon dioxide, and the one I want to talk about is how long do they last in the atmosphere? Okay, and I show this as half-time. Now, by half-time, what I mean is, supposing you had a certain amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, nothing more came in, and you just watched how long would it take for that to sort of dissipate as it starts going through its geological cycle. Well, it turns out it takes centuries. Okay, now, what does that mean? That means that warming from CO2 is essentially irreversible. Okay? It's a one-way street. The amount that we've put into the atmosphere is not coming out again. Sorry. Okay? That's something that's very different in terms of a problem. Okay? It's a problem that will only get worse. So I'm just kind of illustrating this over on this side, where here's our original graph of carbon dioxide increase. Supposing we just stop it right there, could magically say no more CO2 going into the atmosphere, what's going to happen? This is not going to come back down to a nice level that will return the Earth to its original state of warming. It's going to go straight across. So everything that's happening now is just going to continue to happen. Okay? And to the extent that we keep putting more in, it's just going to get worse. Okay, and you need to remember that when we think about what we're going to do. Now, the one thing that is a little bit hopeful is that methane has a half-time of 10 years. So if we could magically stop all the methane coming into the atmosphere, you would get the effect of reducing warming from the reduction in the amount of methane in the atmosphere. That's very important, and it's something that we have to grab a hold of in terms of what we do going into the future. Okay, now I just want to say one thing about about us in carbon dioxide. Again, this is cumulative, so it just comes in and it stays. Okay, if you look at the contribution of carbon dioxide from fossil fuel combustion by all of different major countries and so forth, the United States is just an outlier. We've produced almost half of all of the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. Okay, that puts a lot of responsibility on the United States for finding a solution. The other way of looking at this that I think is useful as well comes from just a very recent article. And that has to do with looking at the contribution per person. Okay, and again, the United States is number one, but now these large economies also, like Germany, United Kingdom, Japan, and so forth, also per person are putting out a substantial amount of carbon dioxide. Why? Because they're first world countries. Their GDPs are higher. They've been using more energy and so forth. I put this up here because you notice China is way down here. And people give China a really bad knock on the fact that they're putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at the present time than we are. But that's not the issue. First of all, it's a cumulative issue. So on a cumulative basis, even in 2020, we had about twice as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as they did, right? But if you look at it per person, they're still much lower, much lower than we are. Okay? So I just say this because I think about it for myself. I have a big responsibility, I and my ancestors, if you will. All right, now we're going to talk about consequences. All right? And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a way of sort of giving you a visual. Here is the way we could think about the world. Let's say here's a scale of changing temperature and so forth. If we look at the world where there was just 1 degree centigrade or about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature, this is what it would look like. The target for the target that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this kind of please, for limiting warming to allow us to escape the worst effects of climate change is 1.5 degrees centigrade, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, if you will. And you can see it's a little bit darker here. This is called the business as usual picture. If we had 4 degrees centigrade, 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit increase, where the whole Earth is burning up, literally. Okay? Now, here's where we were for 1 degree. We're long past that. We may be past the 1.5 degrees. Now, maybe if we got rid of all the methane, we could bring us back. Okay, but that's a question. So, where are we going to end up? So again, coming from the IPCC, they do what they think about as future scenarios. Okay? Here's, and they do it this way. They show, let's say, over time, for business as usual, we're just going to keep putting more and more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere actually every year. So it's going to look something like this, and we're going to get up to this enormous increase in temperature. The 1.5 degree or 1.4 degree in this one is coming down here. And what it means is we've got to cut our emissions by half by 2030. You've probably heard that many times now. We have to cut our total emissions by half by 2030 in order to follow this pathway, if you will. So we're probably not going to make this one. Where are we going to end up here? So I'm going to sort of recast this, this graph by taking temperature and just putting it over here. And temperature goes along with carbon dioxide, so we should be able to do that. Let's put temperature over here. We're going to have the same pathways, if you will. And then we're going to look at what's going to happen as projected by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So here's our temperature. Here's the time. Here's our various scenarios. Here's the business as usual one. And what we're going to look at is the risks for terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, which are going to be dependent, of course, upon the temperature that we're at when we get here. And then here's just a brief sort of introduction to the way they want to talk about this. But if you think about these ecosystems, they're going to look at several different measures like biodiversity, structure of the ecosystem, is it intact, is it broken down, and so forth. Going to focus on the status of trees because they're so important in the ecosystems, and then an event that is a destructive feature in ecosystems, wildfires. And you can see that they're looking at this going from moderate effects to high effects to very high effects, if you And the reason they chose 1.5 degrees is you can see this is kind of the place where we're at the interface between moderate and high. Okay? And if we go above this, we get into this range. Biodiversity is particularly sensitive to this, but structure as well, trees and wildfires. And I've just, illustrated this over here by what's going to be happening to the character of ecosystems as we go along. Okay? Now I'm going to conclude right here, next time we're going to talk about these things, not particularly these particular ones, but we're going to focus more intensively on what is going to happen if we don't very quickly get a hold of our carbon dioxide emissions. And let me just say one thing in conclusion here, perhaps you want to think about this week. It's not as if we just discovered this and we just found out, oh my gosh, we have to do something about this. Okay, there was a major report in the middle 1960s by the Johnson administration about restoration of ecosystems that had a substantial section on climate change and the concern that if we keep putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're going to have real problems. In 1979, there was the so-called Charney Report by the National Academy of Sciences, which was a full-blown scientific review report and so forth that predicted what would happen. Their prediction in 1979 is the same prediction of 2021 by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we knew in 1979 what was going to happen in terms of temperature change as we put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. There also was a large report by the Carter administration on the same issue. The United Nations started having their annual meetings on climate change in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. The Paris Climate Accords were signed in 2016, and yet all through this period, temperatures continue to go up. The amount of carbon dioxide going to the atmosphere is continuing to go ahead. That's a very sobering thought that with all of this information, we still haven't been able to bring ourselves to the point of saying, we got to do it. It may be painful, but our future, our children's future, and so forth is totally dependent upon getting us to net zero carbon emissions as quickly as possible. Okay, I'm going to end here, and next week we're going to talk more in depth about what is really foreseen in terms of climate change, how we can address it from a technical standpoint, and then talk about the climate inequity plan in Milwaukee.
Who has the first question?
This isn't a question, it's a little bit of hope. There's a relatively new satellite that can zero in on where the methane's coming from. And in the next 2 weeks, there are business conferences going on with power companies that are talking about how to turn that off. So there are things.
Well, there is hope in the sense that I don't think it was the immediate last one, maybe the one before, United Nations Annual Conference on Climate, there was an agreement that by 2030, all this methane was going to be under control, okay? We Energies, in its own literature, says the same thing, okay? I'll believe it when we see it. I mean, this is the problem. It's easy to say it, but when it comes up against politics, when it comes up against business interests, when it comes up against maybe even technical issues, then, you know, are we going to do it or are we not? So I hear you about the hope, I hope that's correct.
I'm looking at the your pie chart with the carbon dioxide, methane. I'm kind of trying to get my head around the numbers. I probably never will, but based on your numbers, with methane at 16% of that chart and carbon dioxide at 65, carbon dioxide is 4 times what methane is in terms of the total pie chart. In terms of this pulling on this lever of methane, does it mean in terms of actual impact on global temperature or the temperature of the atmosphere, are our efforts to lower methane only 1/4 as effective as our efforts to lower carbon, or for some reason is methane a larger contributor? Does it punch above its weight in terms of actually warming the atmosphere? Does that make any sense?
Yes. Whoops. Yeah. So here's the key thing. In terms of being a greenhouse gas, that is, being able to absorb heat, carbon dioxide just starts out as a unit 1. Methane is 80 times as potent. So it's very important. And so getting methane under control is extremely important. And as I said, because the resident molecules in the atmosphere leave with a half-time of 10 years, that means over 30 years you'll essentially have removed all of the methane that was there at some point in time. Okay, so within a relatively short time, we could reduce the temperature by what methane is contributing. But that's only going to work for us and help us if we're actually working on carbon dioxide. Because if you keep putting more carbon dioxide in, then it's just going to replace what we hope to do with the methane.
Just a comment with regard to methane. The Arctic areas are warming at a faster rate than the rest of the planet. Now, in the Arctic, the ground is frozen a lot of the time, and within the Arctic soil, there's a molecule called a calathrate, which really contains a lot of methane. So there's a possibility as the Arctic warms up, the methane stored in the ground in the Arctic is going to be released. Now, as an oceanographer, there's also, oceanographers have found that off the eastern coast of the US, there is a lot of methane buried in sediments. And what my worry is that with the increased temperatures of the oceans, you are changing, like the Gulf Stream, the currents which take heat all over the world. Now, when you melt the ice caps, okay, you change the composition of the ocean, and the currents have a possibility of changing. So one of my worries, and maybe just I'm the only one worried about it from my perspective, but if you start eroding those sediments, you're going to be also releasing a lot of methane. So all this is interconnected. So anything we do at any point of this is very helpful.
I'm going to be the bad guy. Can we go back to your GDP slide? Here's all I care about is my GDP.
Okay?
You can, yeah. I'm being facetious, but we all know that comment. I mean, that's the concern that we have.
That's what you wanted me to go back for? Okay. Okay. Got it.
Yeah, that's all I wanted
Got
to
it.
say.
Got it.
As the geoscience here, professor, I just wanted to follow up with Shells. What I worry about is one step farther. If you change the ocean currents, and I think it's about 5 degrees is all we need off of Greenland, we'll have so much melt and fresh water coming in that it'll be so warm on top, like you were saying, Professor Peters, that we won't have the bigger ocean current of the dropping of the warm water into the deep water, and you'll get the anoxic event. So we'll lose the circulation. And if the warm water stays on top and the cold water stays on the bottom, and they don't do a big global alert, you'll get things like hydrogen cyanide. You'll get horrible gases released to the atmosphere. And we've had periods in our history, 90% of all species in the oceans died, 70-some% of all the land because of this anoxic or deoxygenizing the ocean from the cycle not working because it just got too warm. So that Gulf Stream that comes across, goes over to Greenland, needs to dive down and go around the ocean. And if it doesn't dive down, the oceans lose their oxygen, and then these chemicals come up, and then things really die. And that's when we have the great dyings and things like that. So that's the part I worry about. So Sean, I'm with you on that. You have 2 people in the audience that are very worried about the oceans right now.
I was just wondering what the major sources of methane are. Where's the methane coming from? I mean, I hear power plants, but what are the sources?
Well, the process of taking methane out of the ground and then eventually burning it has a whole series of steps to that. First of all, there's the fracking that takes place. There's a good deal of leakage that takes place in that process, okay? That may be the major one, but then you put this into pipelines and so forth, and then they go into other pipelines. All of those things have a certain amount of leakage associated with them. So there are just cumulative effects that take place because of this. I would say that's probably the way in some talks I've actually shown, how that process takes place. But because it's a gas, you just have a certain, it's difficult to sort of keep the gas contained. And so at every stage you have a little leakage here and there. Now there are other places that are doing a lot of natural gas fracking and so forth around the world that are not as careful. I can't say that we're great about this, but are not as careful as we are. And so they get actually even more leakage. And the issue of sort of natural generation of methane is going to become an increasingly serious one. As Chell mentioned, I'm going to talk about a little bit next time, up in the Arctic. And, well, again, I'm not sure I can quantitate this, but the other major place that you get methane is basically in waste dumps. And exactly how much that contributes, I guess I can't tell you right now. But it's surely, non-zero because we're generating so much waste.
We have one more question here.
Yeah.
Try as I might, I will never comprehend the scientific underpinnings of all of this. I mean, I try, but I will only have a very superficial understanding. What I'm very interested in is what we can do, how we can make a difference, how we can perhaps influence policy changes, because that has to happen. But I really, really want to start thinking about what we realistically can do.
Well, I'll talk some about this, and I would say that the opportunity exists for, this is not something that, I mean, individuals, of course, all right? Everybody needs to start driving an electric car as they get to that point. Everybody needs to who can do it, put solar panels on their house, and so forth. Every church. I live up in Fox Point, and I look down the street at the Congregational Church and the Lutheran Church and the synagogue there. They all have all of the sunlight coming down, but none of them has solar panels, okay? So there are a lot of things that we sort of individually can do, but then we have to think about this in a little bigger way. And so this climate and equity plan of the city of Milwaukee and potentially of the county. It's supposed to be a city-county plan, but right now it's been accepted by the city. The county is still working on it. But that's something that we're all part of this, part of a county. We should be able to do something about this. Now, your county supervisor, I'm blanking on her name at the present time, but I've met with her, and she says that within the county, even within Whitefish Bay, there's just not much interest in this. When you go to the meeting of the village board and so forth. In Fox Point, at some point I'm scheduled to talk in front of that group, but they're not much interested. They've already told me, so they said make it short. Okay. These are all things that we can work on. We can figure out how to work on.
Without having our hair on fire.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, yeah. Right. Right.
Yep.
So.
Well, it's time for us to wrap up. Next week, impact and what can we do?
Right.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome.
Did you want to?
I just was really curious on your slide that shows those different slopes based on like keeping everything status quo versus
Yeah.
the even keeping everything status quo. Like it was real bad BAU. This one, why does it start to tail off there at the very top of BAU? What happens? Why doesn't it just keep going up and up and up?
Well,
Not that that's good, but
Honestly, I simply took this from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. My guess is that
it's 2100.
if in fact,
I'll take that.
we were at 7.9 degrees, society would be